If you were to design the perfect prison, the kind of place where a man could be buried alive without ever touching a grave, you would build it exactly like this. An island, 12 acres of cold rock rising from one of the most treacherous stretches of water on the American West Coast. Currents that could drag a man sideways faster than he could swim forward. Fog so thick some mornings that the shore, just over a mile away, disappeared entirely. Sharks, hypothermia. And around the perimeter, guards who had been told, in no uncertain terms, that no one had ever escaped from this place. They called it the Rock. And for 29 years, the Rock kept its promise. Men tried, 36 of them across 14 separate attempts. Some were shot, some drowned. Some were dragged back in chains, soaking wet and shivering, their dreams of freedom dissolved by the bay's black water before they'd made it 50 yards from shore. The prison swallowed them all. It became a symbol, not just of punishment, but of permanence, of inevitability. You went to Alcatraz when the system had decided that you were beyond saving, beyond managing, beyond the ordinary machinery of incarceration. You went there when you had become a problem that needed to disappear. And then, on the morning of June 12, 1962, 3 men disappeared instead. Not into the water, not into death, or at least that's what they would have you believe, into the fog. This is the story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, of how 3 convicts armed with spoons, raincoats, and an almost insane amount of patience did what everyone said could not be done, and why, more than 60 years later, no one can say with absolute certainty whether they lived or died. If stories like this one are what you're here for, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, we bring you new stories from the darkest and most fascinating corners of the criminal world. Don't miss a single one. Frank Lee Morris was not a man who inspired sympathy at first glance. By the time federal authorities transferred him to Alcatraz in January of 1960, he had been in and out of correctional institutions since the age of 13. Orphaned young, shuffled between foster homes across the American South, Morris had developed 2 things in abundance: a ferocious intelligence and an absolute contempt for confinement. His IQ was measured at 133, a score that placed him in the top 2% of the population. Prison psychiatrists who evaluated him over the years noted the same thing repeatedly. This was a man who processed information with unusual speed, who planned several moves ahead, who became dangerously bored when not engaged. In a different life, with different circumstances, the same qualities might have made him an engineer, a strategist, an architect. Instead, they made him one of the most persistent escape artists in the American federal prison system. He had escaped from custody before, more than once. Louisiana State Penitentiary, Florida State Prison. Each time, authorities caught him, not because he planned poorly, but because the resources available to him were limited, and the world outside offered little shelter to a man with his record. He would run, survive for weeks or months, and then the slow machinery of law enforcement would grind him back into a cell. But with each escape, each recapture, each new sentence, Morris refined his thinking. He studied what had gone wrong. He adapted. He became, in the language of those who tracked him, a recidivist escape risk, which is a bureaucratic way of saying that keeping Frank Morris locked up required constant, deliberate effort. Alcatraz was that effort, made permanent. When Morris arrived on the Rock, he was 33 years old and had spent more of his life inside institutions than outside them. He was lean, quiet, watchful. He took his meals, attended his work assignments in the prison industries, and said very little to anyone. Guards described him as cooperative, model even. What they did not know, what no one knew yet, was that from the moment Morris walked through the main gate and heard it clang shut behind him, he had begun to look for the way out. John and Clarence Anglin arrived at Alcatraz within months of Morris. John in October of 1960, Clarence in January of 1961. They were brothers from a large, poor Georgia family that had migrated to Michigan in search of work, and they had been committing crimes together since adolescence. Bank robbery was their trade. They were not subtle about it, and they were not particularly successful. But they were persistent, and they shared, with Morris, a pathological inability to accept that any wall was truly final. The brothers had attempted escape before, notably from the federal prison in Atlanta, and it was precisely this history that had earned them their transfers to Alcatraz. Like Morris, they were considered too restless, too resourceful, too likely to cause problems in a standard facility. The assumption was that the rock would break that restlessness, that the cold and the isolation and the sheer physical impossibility of the place would eventually wear them into compliance. The assumption was wrong. John and Clarence were placed in cells in the B-block corridor, the long, tiered row of steel cages that formed the heart of the cell house. Their cells sat close enough to Morris's that whispered exchanges were possible during the brief, supervised periods of movement between work assignments and meals. Close enough to communicate, close enough to plan. A fourth man joined them in the early stages, Alan West, another inmate with a history of attempting escape. West had approached Morris with ideas. Morris had listened, evaluated, and concluded that West's thinking, while enthusiastic, lacked the discipline required. He kept West involved, partly for the labor he could contribute, partly to prevent him from talking to the wrong people. But Morris was always the architect. West was the helper who, as events would ultimately prove, was not quite equal to the demands of the moment. Here is what Frank Morris understood about Alcatraz that most prisoners did not. The rock was old. It had been a military fortification before it became a federal penitentiary. The cell house, the main building that housed the inmates, had been constructed in the 1920s, using concrete that, by the standards of mid-century engineering, was already showing its age. Decades of salt air, moisture from the bay, and the constant cycling of fog and damp had done quiet, invisible work on the building's fabric. The concrete, particularly in the utility corridors that ran behind the cells, had softened. In some places, it had become almost friable, crumbling at the edges when pressure was applied. Morris found this out by accident, running his fingers along the back wall of his cell one evening and feeling the wall give, just slightly, in a way that solid concrete should not. He pressed harder. A small piece broke away. He looked at what was in his hand for a long moment, and then he put it in his pocket and said nothing. The cells in the main block had ventilation grates at the back, near the floor, small steel-framed openings that connected to a utility corridor running the full length of the building. The corridor was narrow, dark, and largely unmonitored. It was a maintenance space, not a security space, and the concrete around the grate frames, Morris had confirmed it now, carefully and methodically over several evenings, was not what it should have been. You could dig through it, not quickly, not easily, but you could dig through it. The question was with what? Metal tools were inventoried and monitored. Anything sharp, anything heavy, anything that could serve as an instrument of escape was tracked with obsessive attention by the prison's custodial staff. But the kitchen, where inmates worked shifts preparing meals for the entire population, was full of ordinary spoons. Spoons that were counted, yes, but whose edges, when worked patiently against concrete night after night, could be worn into something approaching a blade. Morris requisitioned a spoon, then another. He began to work. The digging happened in a window of roughly 30 minutes each night, the period between the last evening count and the first sweep of the night shift. Morris would wait until the cell block quieted, until the sounds of men settling into sleep replaced the ambient noise of the day. Then he would move to the back of his cell, position himself low against the wall, and work the spoon's edge into the concrete around the ventilation grate. The sound was the primary danger. Concrete does not yield silently. Every scrape, every crumble, carried through the stillness of the cell block with uncomfortable clarity. His solution was elegant in its simplicity. The prison had a music program, an hour each evening when inmates were permitted to play instruments in their cells. The program was called, without irony, the music hour, and it filled the cell block with a chaotic, overlapping noise that masked almost everything else. Morris began timing his most aggressive digging to coincide with the loudest passages. When a harmonica shrieked or an accordion wheezed, he drove the spoon harder into the wall. When the music softened, he slowed, working in careful, controlled strokes that barely whispered against the concrete. He communicated the technique to John and Clarence through a system of whispered exchanges during the brief periods when inmates moved between their cells and common areas. The brothers adapted quickly. Within weeks, all three men were digging simultaneously, each working on his own grate, the music covering the sound of three spoons eating slowly through the walls of the most secure prison in America. Allen West was digging too, though his progress was slower. His cell sat in a section of the block where the concrete had been patched during a maintenance cycle some years earlier. Newer material, mixed differently, harder than the surrounding walls. From the beginning, there was a quiet, unspoken anxiety between the four men about whether West would be ready in time. Morris said nothing directly. He simply noted the discrepancy and filed it away, the way he filed away everything, as a variable that would need to be managed. By the spring of 1962, the holes behind 3 of the 4 cells were large enough to crawl through. West was still working, but breaking through the wall was only the first problem. The utility corridor behind the cells led upward. There was a series of pipes and structural elements that could serve as a crude climbing frame to the roof of the cell house. From the roof, it was possible to reach the outer wall of the prison complex and, beyond that, the rocky shoreline of the island. But the bay itself was the real obstacle. Over a mile of water, running cold at roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with currents that could run at several knots in unpredictable directions depending on the tide. A man who entered that water without protection would lose motor function within minutes and be dead within half an hour. They needed a raft. Morris had thought about this for longer than he had thought about almost anything else in his life. The solution, when it came to him, was so straightforward that it almost seemed like a joke. The prison issued each inmate a standard-issue raincoat, a rubberized garment designed to keep out the bay's persistent damp. The coats were unremarkable, individually useless for any purpose beyond their stated function. But 50 of them, carefully disassembled and their panels stitched together with thread pulled from prison-issue clothing, 50 of them could become a raft. Not a good raft, not a safe raft by any conventional measure, but a raft. Getting the coats was a matter of time and patience, and the same quiet social maneuvering that had served Morris throughout his incarceration. Inmates traded things: favors, food, cigarettes, small objects of marginal value. Morris began collecting coats, borrowing some, trading for others, accumulating them in ones and twos over the course of several months until he had enough material to work with. The coats were broken down in the utility corridor, out of sight, their rubber panels separated and stacked. Clarence Anglin, who had some experience with needlework from a work assignment earlier in his sentence, took on the task of stitching the panels together. He worked by feel in near total darkness, his fingers finding the seams by touch, pulling thread through rubber with a crude needle fashioned from a piece of scavenged metal. The raft took shape slowly. It was roughly 6 feet by 14 feet when fully assembled, large enough to hold 3 men, barely. It would not win any engineering awards. The seams leaked. The surface was uneven. But when they inflated a section of it experimentally using a modified concertina, a squeeze box instrument that Morris had obtained through the music program and adapted into a crude bellows, it held air. Not perfectly, not indefinitely, but it held. The same concertina bellows system would be used on the night of the escape to inflate the raft quickly on the shoreline. Every minute spent on the island after leaving the cell house was a minute in which a guard could spot them, a searchlight could catch them, a dog could find their scent. The inflation had to be fast. Morris had practiced the motion until it was automatic. Pump, check the seam. Pump again, keep moving. Along with the raft, they built paddles. 2 of them constructed from scraps of wood and plywood collected over months from the prison's maintenance workshop, where inmates were occasionally assigned to assist with minor repairs. The blades were shaped by hand, rough but functional, and fitted to wooden handles with bindings of rubber strip cut from the coat material. Morris tested the binding tension in the utility corridor, pulling against each joint until he was satisfied that it would hold under sustained use. The paddles were broken down into their component parts for transport and would be assembled on the shoreline before launch. There was one more problem, and it was the kind of problem that revealed the full depth of Morris's operational thinking. When the guards made their nightly counts, which happened at regular intervals throughout the night, a flashlight beam sweeping across each cell, checking for the presence of a sleeping body, the beds needed to appear occupied. An empty cell discovered at 2 in the morning would trigger an immediate alarm. The entire island would lock down. The bay would be watched. Whatever head start they had built would evaporate in minutes. The solution was the heads. Morris had read somewhere in the accumulated reading of a life spent in institutions about the use of dummy figures in earlier escape attempts at other prisons. The concept was simple. The execution was not. He needed objects that would pass under a moving flashlight beam in a darkened cell for the head and upper torso of a sleeping man. They needed to be the right size, the right color, positioned correctly against the pillow. And they needed to be made from materials available inside Alcatraz. He settled on papier-mâché. The prison's art program, another one of those institutional gestures toward rehabilitation that Morris had learned to exploit systematically, provided access to paper, paste, and paint. Over a period of weeks, working in the utility corridor during the digging sessions, Morris and the Anglins constructed 3 heads. They built them up layer by layer, the way a sculptor builds a form, adding paper and paste and letting each layer dry before adding the next. They shaped the features roughly, not portraits, not detailed, just enough to suggest a human face in dim light. They painted the skin tones with care, matching their own complexions as closely as the available pigments allowed. For hair, they collected clippings from the prison barbershop floor, pressing them into the wet paste at the crown of each head. The finished objects were crude. In full light, they would have fooled no one. But in the darkness of a cell at 2 in the morning, with a guard moving briskly down the corridor, checking each bunk with a 3-second sweep of a flashlight, in those conditions, they were exactly good enough. Morris set a date, June 11, 1962. The plan was complete. The tools were ready. The raft was built. The paddles were assembled and waiting in the utility corridor alongside the dummy heads, which stared at nothing with their painted eyes. All that remained was the night itself. And the night, as it always does, eventually came. The night they chose was not chosen arbitrarily. Morris had been watching the tide charts, smuggled in pieces through the prison's library system, cross-referenced with the behavior of the bay he had studied from the island's perimeter during exercise periods. And he knew that the tidal window on the night of June 11th into the early hours of June 12, 1962, offered the most favorable current conditions of any night that month. The tide, at the right hour, would push northward toward the Marin headlands, rather than pulling laterally toward the open ocean. It was not a guarantee, it was a probability, and in the world Frank Morris inhabited, probabilities were the closest thing to certainty that existed. The days leading up to the escape had a quality that Morris would later describe to no one, because there was no one to describe it to, as a kind of controlled electricity. Everything felt sharpened. The food tasted different. The sounds of the cell block, so familiar after 2 years that they had become invisible, suddenly reasserted themselves with uncomfortable clarity. The clang of the steel doors, the shuffle of feet on concrete, the distant, persistent sound of the bay, always there beneath everything, a low, constant note that the island produced as naturally as breathing. He did not sleep well in those final days. Neither did John or Clarence, though none of them acknowledged this to each other. There was an unspoken agreement among the 3 men to perform normalcy with absolute commitment right up until the moment it was no longer necessary. They ate their meals. They attended their work assignments. They spoke to guards with the same mild, cooperative effect they had cultivated for months. Any deviation from the established pattern, any tension in the voice, any hesitation, any flicker of something that a trained observer might read as anticipation, could trigger the kind of scrutiny that would end everything. Alan West was the variable that worried Morris most. West was not a calm man by nature. In the weeks before the planned date, Morris had noticed West talking too much. Not about the escape, never directly about that, but talking in general with an excess of energy that felt like pressure escaping from a system under too much strain. Morris pulled him aside during one of the music sessions, their exchange covered by the noise of the cell block's amateur orchestra. "You need to slow down," Morris said quietly, his back to the corridor, his voice barely above a murmur. "I'm fine," West said. "I know you think you are. Slow down anyway." West looked at him for a moment, then nodded. He was quieter after that. But Morris noted the exchange, filed it away, and adjusted his internal assessment of the fourth man accordingly. West's hole was still not finished. Morris had known for 2 weeks that it might not be finished in time. He had said nothing, because saying something would have required either delaying the escape or confronting West with a truth that might destabilize him entirely. Neither option was acceptable. The date stood. The evening of June 11th arrived like any other evening on the Rock. Dinner was served at 5:30. The meal was unremarkable. The kitchen produced unremarkable meals as a matter of institutional policy. The inmates ate, returned to their cells, and the cell block settled into its evening rhythm. The music hour began at 7. Morris sat on his bunk and listened to the familiar cacophony with a detachment that surprised him. He felt, in that moment, entirely calm. Not the forced calm of a man suppressing fear, but something genuine. The stillness that comes when a plan that has been rehearsed so many times it has become reflex is finally about to be executed. At 9:30, the last official count of the evening was completed. The guard moved down the corridor, flashlights sweeping, checking each cell with practiced efficiency. He passed Morris's cell, paused for less than a second, moved on. Morris waited another 30 minutes. Then he moved. He pulled the ventilation grate from the wall. It came free now with a single careful motion, the concrete around its frame long since reduced to dust and carefully swept away over months of work. He pushed the dummy head into position on his pillow, arranging the blanket with quick, practiced movements. In the darkness of the cell, the figure looked like a man sleeping on his side, one arm extended, the crude painted face turned away from the corridor. He did not look at it again. He went through the hole in the wall. The utility corridor was exactly as it had always been, narrow, dark, smelling of damp concrete and the faint chemical odor of the building's aging infrastructure. Morris moved along it quickly, navigating by memory and touch, heading for the prearranged meeting point where the corridor opened into a wider service space near the base of the climb to the roof. John and Clarence were already there. He could hear their breathing before he saw them, the slightly elevated rhythm of men who were frightened and holding it together through will alone. There was no sign of West. Morris waited 90 seconds. He counted them. Then he looked at the darkness in the direction of West's cell and made the decision that he had already, in some part of himself, made 2 weeks earlier. West's hole was not finished. West was not coming. They were leaving without him. The three of them exchanged no further words. There was nothing to say. Everything had been said, planned, rehearsed. They began to climb. The pipes and structural crossbars that formed their route to the roof had been assessed during maintenance periods when the utility spaces were occasionally accessed by prison staff, the men memorizing the route during brief, carefully managed glimpses. The climb was approximately 50 feet, not extreme by any measure, but in darkness, on pipes that were slick with condensation, carrying the deflated raft and the inflation equipment and the component parts of the paddles. It required a degree of physical control that left all three men breathing hard by the time they reached the top. The roof hatch had been the subject of considerable anxiety in the weeks before the escape. It was not locked. It was a maintenance access point, not a security barrier. But it was stiff, its frame swollen with moisture, and Morris had been unable to test it in advance without risking detection. He pressed against it with his shoulder, felt it resist, pressed harder. For 3 seconds, nothing happened, and in those 3 seconds, something cold moved through him that was not the temperature of the air. Then it gave. With a sound that seemed, in the silence of the night, absolutely enormous, a grinding, scraping protest of metal against metal, the hatch swung open, and the cold air of the bay hit them like a wall. Morris was through first. He lay flat on the roof immediately, pressing himself against the surface, scanning the perimeter. The searchlights swept in their regular patterns, predictable as they had always been. The guard towers were positioned at the corners of the complex. The nearest was to the south, its beam moving in a slow arc that, at this moment, was pointed away from them. Morris counted the seconds, watched the pattern. Then he waved the Anglins through. The 3 men crossed the roof in a low crawl, moving between the searchlight sweeps with a timing that had been calculated and recalculated so many times it had taken on the quality of something mechanical. Below them, the island was quiet. The cell house hummed with the sounds of sleeping men, oblivious. Somewhere in the complex, a guard was making his rounds, his footsteps completely inaudible from this height, his flashlight a moving point of light that bore no relation to where they were. They reached the north edge of the roof. Below them, a pipe ran down the exterior wall to the ground, another element of the escape route that Morris had identified and mentally rehearsed. He went over the edge first, finding the pipe with his feet, descending hand over hand in the cold dark. The pipe was wet. His palm slipped twice. He corrected without stopping, without making a sound, and reached the ground in less than a minute. John came next, then Clarence. They assembled at the base of the wall, crouching in the shadow of the building, and for a moment, all 3 of them simply breathed. The night air smelled of salt and kelp and the particular cold mineral scent of the bay at low tide. Above them, the cell house loomed, its windows dark. Around them, the island was silent except for the wind moving through the sparse vegetation on the rocky slopes and the distant rhythmic sound of the water below. They had made it off the building. They were still on the island. There was still a long way to go. Morris checked his bearings and moved. The route to the water's edge had been mapped in his mind for months, across a stretch of open ground that offered minimal cover, down a rocky embankment to the narrow strip of shoreline where the bay began. They moved in single file, Morris leading, the Anglins close behind, staying low, staying quiet, using the shadows of the perimeter structures wherever the path allowed. It took them 12 minutes to reach the water. 12 minutes that felt, to each of them, considerably longer. At one point, a light swept across the ground 30 feet to their left, a guard making a patrol round, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark in a wide arc. All 3 men went flat instantly, pressing themselves into the shadows. The light passed. The footsteps continued, moved away, faded. They waited 30 seconds after the sound disappeared before rising and continuing. At the shoreline, Morris unpacked the raft and set to work inflating it with the concertina bellows. The rubber panels expanded slowly in the cold air, each pump of the bellows producing a progress that seemed, under the circumstances, agonizingly modest. John assembled the paddles beside him, fitting the plywood blades to their handles, tightening the rubber bindings, checking each joint with a firm pull before setting the paddle down and moving to the next. Clarence kept watch, facing back toward the prison complex, his eyes moving constantly across the dark landscape for any sign of movement, any change in the pattern of the lights. None came. Morris could hear a faint hiss from somewhere along the left side of the raft, a slow leak at one of the seams. He pressed his palm against it, located the precise point, and applied a strip from the patch kit he had carried out. Rubber and contact adhesive, improvised from materials available in the prison workshop. He held it for 30 seconds, released, and resumed pumping. The structure was sound enough. It would float. It would have to. At approximately 11:30 on the night of June 11, 1962, 3 men pushed a homemade rubber raft into the waters of San Francisco Bay and climbed aboard. The cold hit them immediately. Even without full immersion, the bay air at that hour and the spray off the water dropped the temperature around them by what felt like 10 degrees in an instant. Morris felt it in his hands first, a stiffening in the fingers, a reduction in the precision of his grip on the paddle. He noted it, registered it as a problem to be managed, and began to paddle. Behind them, on the island, Alan West was still in the utility corridor, working at his wall with bleeding fingers, alone in the dark, listening to the sound of the bay and understanding, with a certainty that settled over him like cold water, that the others were already gone. The current took them almost immediately. Not violently. There was no sudden lurch, no dramatic moment of being seized by the water. It was subtler than that, and in some ways more frightening. The raft simply began to move in a direction that was not entirely the direction they were paddling, as though the bay had its own opinion about where they were going and was expressing it quietly but firmly. Morris had anticipated this. The tidal charts had told him the current would run northward at this hour, and northward was broadly the direction they needed, toward the Marin headlands, toward land, away from the open ocean to the west. But anticipating a current and feeling it beneath you in the dark are two different experiences, and for the first few minutes on the water, Morris focused entirely on the relationship between his paddle strokes and the raft's actual movement, calibrating, adjusting, learning the particular character of the water they were crossing. The bay at night was not silent. It had a voice. A complex, layered sound made up of the chop of small waves against the raft's sides, the distant groan of the Golden Gate Bridge to the northwest, the occasional deep note of a foghorn somewhere out toward the open ocean, and beneath all of it, a low, omnipresent hiss that was simply the sound of a large body of water existing at night. Morris found the sound useful. It told him things about the water's state, its movement, its mood. He listened to it the way a navigator listens to an instrument. John paddled on the right side of the raft, Clarence on the left. Morris positioned himself at the front, setting the direction, watching the darkness ahead for any sign of the shoreline. The lights of San Francisco glowed to the east, too far, too dangerous, not the destination. To the north, the Marin headlands were a dark mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, identifiable more by the absence of light than by any positive feature. That was where they were going. That was where the plan said they needed to be. The distance was just over a mile. In calm water, with a decent craft and experienced paddlers, a mile takes perhaps 20 minutes. The water that night was not calm, the craft was not decent, and none of the three men were experienced in open water navigation. The raft moved. It leaked from the patched seam on the left side with a persistence that required periodic attention. Every few minutes, Morris would press his palm against the worst section, hold it, and return to paddling. It was not a permanent fix. It was a delay, and delay was all he needed. 40 minutes into the crossing, the island was no longer visible behind them. This fact registered differently for each of the three men. For Clarence, it produced something that was almost relief, the feeling of a weight lifting, of a presence that had defined his existence for over a year, finally receding into the dark. For John, it produced anxiety. Without the island as a reference point, the bay felt immense and directionless, a black plain extending in all directions with no visible boundary. He paddled harder, which was the right response even if the motivation was fear. For Morris, the disappearance of the island behind them was simply data. It told him approximately how far they had come, approximately how long they had been on the water, and approximately how far they still had to go. He processed it and kept paddling. What none of them spoke about, what none of them had spoken about in all the months of planning, was what would happen if the raft failed entirely. If the seams gave way simultaneously, if the rubber panels separated, if they found themselves in the water rather than on it. The bay at that temperature gave a man perhaps 15 minutes of useful consciousness before hypothermia degraded his motor function to the point where swimming became impossible. 15 minutes in water that offered no handhold, no purchase, no way out. Morris had known this from the beginning. He had simply decided that it was not a scenario worth planning for because there was no plan that addressed it. You either made it across or you did not, and the planning was over the moment you entered the water. He focused on the paddling. An hour into the crossing, John's paddle broke. It did not break dramatically. The binding that held the plywood blade to the wooden handle simply gave way, the strips of rubber separating under the sustained stress of repeated strokes in cold water. One moment John was paddling, the next he was holding a handle with nothing on the end of it, and the blade was floating away to the right, visible for a moment as a pale rectangle against the dark water before the current took it. Morris heard the change in the raft's movement before John said anything. The subtle asymmetry of 2 paddles instead of 3, the raft beginning to yaw slightly to the right. He turned, assessed the situation in a single glance, and made a decision. "Use your hands," he said, "both of them. Keep the stroke even." John looked at the useless handle in his grip, then dropped it into the raft and plunged both hands into the water. It was cold enough that the shock of it produced an involuntary sound, something between a gasp and a grunt that he suppressed immediately. He began to stroke. The raft steadied. They continued. The Marin headlands grew slowly from a suggestion to a certainty. First, the darker mass of the cliffs becoming distinguishable from the sky, then the faint line of vegetation at the cliff tops, then the individual features of the shoreline resolving out of the darkness as they drew closer. Morris allowed himself, for the first time since entering the water, something approaching optimism. Not confidence, not certainty, but the cautious, provisional sense that the variables were resolving in their favor. They were perhaps 200 yards from shore when the raft's left side deflated. Not gradually. The seam that had been leaking for the entire crossing finally gave way along a 6-inch section, and the air that had been slowly escaping through it now rushed out in a sustained hiss that was loud enough to hear over the sound of the water. The left side of the raft dropped immediately, tilting the entire structure and sending the 3 men lurching toward the low side. Cold water came over the edge. Not enough to swamp them, not immediately, but enough to soak them to the waist and drop the temperature of their bodies by several degrees in seconds. Morris grabbed the patch kit. His hands were stiff with cold, the dexterity in his fingers reduced to something barely adequate, and finding the right strip of rubber in the dark while the raft tilted and water sloshed around him required a focused effort of will that he felt in his jaw muscles, in the tension across his shoulders. He found the strip, found the seam, pressed. "Keep paddling," he said. His voice was level. Clarence and John paddled. The raft moved. The patch held. Not perfectly. The air continued to escape, but at a reduced rate. Enough to keep the left side partially inflated, enough to keep the structure above the waterline. The raft was sitting lower in the water with every passing minute, the freeboard shrinking, the surface beneath them growing progressively softer. But the shore was 200 yards away, then 150, then 100. At 75 yards, Morris could see individual rocks on the shoreline, dark shapes rising from the water in the pre-dawn darkness. He could hear the sound of the bay breaking against them, a rhythmic, percussive sound that was, in that moment, the most beautiful thing he had ever heard in his life. At 50 yards, the raft was sitting so low in the water that paddling had become nearly useless. The rubber was soft beneath them, the structure barely maintaining its form. Morris put his own hands in the water and joined the stroking, all 3 men pulling toward shore with everything they had left, which was not very much. At 20 yards, he felt the remaining paddle touch bottom. They did not land gracefully. The raft scraped against a submerged rock, tilted sharply, and deposited all 3 men into water that came up to their thighs. The cold of it after the relative insulation of the raft was stunning, a full-body shock that drove the breath from Morris's lungs and made his legs feel, for a moment, like they belonged to someone else. He stood, found his footing on the rocky bottom, took 3 steps, and was on dry land. John and Clarence came out of the water beside him, gasping, soaked, shaking with cold. The raft drifted behind them, half deflated, turning slowly in the small waves near the shore. Morris looked at it for a moment, this thing they had built over months from spoons and raincoats and ingenuity, and then looked away. It had done what it needed to do. What happened to it now was irrelevant. The three men stood on the shore of the Marin Headlands in the early hours of June 12, 1962, and for a long moment, none of them said anything at all. It was Clarence who broke the silence. "We made it," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, as though he did not entirely trust the statement and was testing it rather than declaring it. Morris looked at the water behind them, at the darkness where the island had been, at the first faint gray suggestion of dawn beginning to form above the hills to the east. "Not yet," he said. "We made it to the shore. Now we disappear." Disappearing is harder than escaping. This is the truth that most people, when they imagine a prison break, fail to account for. The escape itself, the digging, the climbing, the crossing, is a problem of engineering and nerve. It has defined parameters, a beginning and an end, a moment of completion. Disappearing is different. Disappearing is not an event. It is a process, ongoing and permanent, that requires you to unmake yourself so thoroughly that the person who existed before simply ceases to be findable. It requires money you do not have, documents that do not exist, contacts who are willing to risk federal charges to help you, and the discipline to never, under any circumstances, reach back toward anything that was yours before. Morris knew this better than either of the Anglins. He had been caught after previous escapes precisely because disappearing had proved harder than escaping, and he had learned from each failure with the same systematic attention he brought to everything else. This time he had thought further ahead. There were people on the outside, people who owed favors, or who could be persuaded that helping three escaped federal prisoners was worth the risk. The details of those arrangements have never been fully established, which is itself a kind of evidence that they existed. You do not simply walk off a prison island into the California night and vanish without infrastructure. Someone helped them. The question of who has never been definitively answered. What happened in the hours immediately after they reached shore is the first of the story's genuine mysteries. A stolen car was reported missing from a location near Marin that morning. Clothes were reported taken from a house not far from the shoreline. These were the thin, fragmentary traces of three men moving fast and deliberately away from the water, shedding their prison-damp clothing, acquiring whatever they could, putting distance between themselves and the bay as quickly as possible. But the traces stopped. Within 24 hours of the escape, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had ceased to produce any evidence of their existence whatsoever. Back on Alcatraz, the discovery of the escape unfolded with a slowness that would, in the aftermath, become deeply embarrassing to the Bureau of Prisons. The morning count began at 6:30, as it did every morning. Officer Bill Long moved down the corridor of B Block with the methodical efficiency of a man who had performed this task thousands of times without incident. He reached the cell of John Anglin and swept his flashlight across the bunk. A figure lay there, turned away from the corridor, dark hair visible above the blanket. Long moved on. He reached Clarence's cell, the same, a sleeping figure, motionless, unremarkable. He moved on to Morris's cell, again, a still shape beneath a blanket, a head on the pillow, everything exactly as it should be. It was only when Long completed the full count and came up one short, a number that could not be reconciled no matter how many times he walked the corridor, that he went back and looked more carefully. He reached through the bars of John's cell and touched the face on the pillow. His fingers met painted paper. The alarm went out at 7:18 in the morning. By that point, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had been gone for approximately 8 hours. Alan West was found shortly afterward, still on the island. He had spent the entire night working at his wall, but the concrete had refused to yield in time. When the guards reached him, he was exhausted, his fingers raw, the hole behind his cell still not quite large enough to pass through. He offered no resistance. He sat down on the floor of the utility corridor and told them everything: the plan, the timeline, the raft, the heads, the title calculations. He answered every question put to him with the thoroughness of a man who understood that cooperation was now his only currency. His testimony became the foundation of the FBI's reconstruction of the escape, and it was more detailed and accurate than the Bureau could have hoped for. West had been there for all of it. He had simply not been there at the end. The response to the escape was immediate and large in scale. The Coast Guard deployed vessels across the bay. Helicopters swept the shoreline. FBI agents arrived on the island within the hour and began the forensic work of reconstructing what had happened. The cells were examined, the holes in the walls measured and photographed, the dummy heads collected as evidence. The utility corridor was searched from end to end. The roof hatch, still slightly ajar from the night before, was noted and documented. What investigators found told them a great deal about the method of the escape and almost nothing about where the men had gone. The raft was recovered, or rather, pieces of it were recovered, washing up on Angel Island to the north of Alcatraz over the following days. The partial deflation and the evidence of water ingress led some investigators to conclude that the raft had failed catastrophically in the middle of the bay and that all 3 men had drowned. This became, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, the official position. The FBI was not entirely convinced. The investigation that followed was one of the most sustained manhunts in the Bureau's history. Agents interviewed family members of all 3 men. They monitored known associates. They traced the stolen car, the missing clothes, every fragmentary lead that the first days after the escape had produced. They sent queries to law enforcement agencies across the country, then internationally, watching for any sign that 3 men matching the descriptions of Morris and the Anglins had surfaced anywhere. For months, then years, the investigation continued. New leads arrived periodically, a reported sighting here, a letter that might have been from one of the men there, and each was followed up with the full resources of the Bureau. None of them held up. In 1979, 17 years after the escape, the FBI officially closed its investigation. The conclusion was the one that had been the default position since the beginning. Morris and the Anglin brothers had most likely drowned in San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11th into June 12, 1962. The case was transferred to the United States Marshals Service, which continued to carry it as an open fugitive matter, a bureaucratic distinction that meant the men were still technically wanted, their warrants never formally withdrawn, but that active investigative resources were no longer being devoted to finding them. The Marshals Service still carries the case today, but the FBI's closure of its investigation did not end the story. If anything, it opened a new chapter, one defined not by evidence but by its absence, and by the very human tendency to fill that absence with possibility. The Anglin family never accepted that John and Clarence had drowned. This was not simply denial, it was based on specific, concrete claims. In the years after the escape, family members said they received Christmas cards postmarked from locations in South America. Photographs emerged, blurry, disputed, their authenticity impossible to confirm, purporting to show 2 men who looked like the Anglin brothers, aged appropriately for the years that had passed, living somewhere outside the United States. A woman who had known the family claimed that John and Clarence had attended their mother's funeral in the 1970s, disguised, present for only a short time before disappearing again. None of these claims could be verified. All of them were investigated. None produced a definitive result. Then, in 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter. It was written in a hand that investigators compared against known samples from the case files. The letter claimed to be from John Anglin. It said that all 3 men had survived the crossing. It said that Frank Morris had died in 2008 at the age of 81. It said that Clarence had died in 2011. And it said that the writer, John, if the letter was genuine, was in poor health and willing to turn himself in exchange for medical treatment and a sentence of no more than 1 year rather than the remainder of his original term. The FBI re-examined the case in response. Handwriting analysts studied the letter. The claims were investigated as thoroughly as any cold case from more than 60 years prior can be investigated. The Bureau ultimately concluded that it could neither confirm nor deny the letter's authenticity. It was real paper, real ink, real handwriting that bore meaningful similarity to the samples on file. It was also entirely possible that it was the work of someone who had studied the case carefully enough to produce a convincing imitation. The offer contained in the letter was never taken up. No one appeared to claim the deal. If John Anglin wrote it, he apparently decided that even a single year in prison was too high a price for whatever remained of his freedom. If someone else wrote it, their reasons for doing so have never been established. What remains, when all the investigations and theories and family claims and disputed photographs are set aside, is a story with no ending. 3 men went into San Francisco Bay on a homemade raft on a cold June night and were never conclusively accounted for again. The authorities say they drowned. The evidence for this is the absence of evidence that they survived, which is, as any logician will tell you, not the same thing as evidence of drowning. The raft was partially recovered. No bodies were ever found. The bay's currents, unpredictable and powerful, could have carried bodies out through the Golden Gate and into the Pacific, where they would never be recovered. This is true. It is also true that 3 intelligent, motivated, determined men with a plan and outside support could have survived and disappeared into lives that left no trace. The honest answer is that no one knows. And that is precisely why, more than 60 years after the night in question, the story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers retains the hold it has on the imagination. It is not a story about failure. The 35 other escape attempts from Alcatraz, all of them either fatal or resulting in recapture, are stories about failure, and history does not linger over them. It is not quite a story about success either, because success would have a confirmed ending, and this story has none. It exists in the space between those categories, a story about possibility, about the refusal to accept the terms that have been imposed on you, about what a human being can accomplish with a spoon and a raincoat, and the particular kind of intelligence that institutions cannot train out of a person, no matter how long they try. Frank Morris spent the first 33 years of his life being told, in various ways, that he was contained, that the walls around him were final, that the systems designed to hold him were stronger than his ability to overcome them. He answered that argument once, definitively, on a cold night in June, and then he was gone. Whether he lived to enjoy it is a question that history has declined to answer. But he got off the rock, and in the end, in the world of Alcatraz, where the only currency that mattered was the degree to which a man could resist being permanently reduced to nothing, that was enough.